northernmost point and the highest point, basically the pinnacle of Mount Moriah. So the crucifixion site, where would Jesus Christ be crucified? Well, we know that he would be crucified at the place of the skull. That would be outside the city gate, near the Praetorium, by the way, at a garden on Mount Moriah. And Jesus Christ fulfilled these 4 points. At least this site that we have today fulfills these 4 points for the location. Now, we have other information about the tomb where he was buried. Where was the tomb? Well, we have 3 fascinating bits of information about the tomb site. It was near Golgotha, near the place of the skull. It was in a garden and near a water source. Now, taking these in order, the first point is that the tomb site where Christ was buried, that site was near Golgotha, the place of the skull. And I'm going to read this verse for you again from John chapter 19, verse 41. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So we know that the place where he was crucified was right adjacent, right next. In the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden there was a tomb. So that tells us a lot about the juxtaposition of all this. And you saw the skull. And as we pan to the left, maybe 30 yards or so, there's a garden. And there's still a beautiful garden there to this very day. But how about 2,000 years ago? Well, we're going to show you now how we know there was a thriving garden there 2,000 years ago. There is, on that location, still today, buried for centuries with rubble, dirt, garbage, but excavated just in the last 100 years, is a wine press. And here we'll show you a picture of this rather large wine press. The size, the shape, the style of the construction of it fits perfectly into the time of Jesus Christ, when Jerusalem was a thriving center, cultural center. That wine press is today in this small garden area that's next to the skull and the tomb in the garden. It's all right there. Now, to have a garden in Israel today or 2,000 years ago, you would need a water source. You need it because, well, they just don't get enough rain for just rainfall to take care of your garden. So it neither needs to be near a spring or a cistern. Have to be a pretty large cistern. Well, guess what's right under the small garden, the garden tomb in Jerusalem? A cistern. Now, this is an actual photograph taken just not too many years ago of the cistern. When you go to the garden tomb and you walk through the garden, you're walking over this cistern. It's 65 feet wide, long, 40 feet wide. You can see those people on that ladder. It's huge. In fact, it holds over 200,000 gallons, and it is the largest cistern in northern Jerusalem. Now, a cistern like that, in that wine press, they didn't have gardens back in Jerusalem really just for show. Maybe Herod might in his palace grounds, but people didn't do that. Gardens were working gardens. They were places where you grew olives or you grew grapes and you turned them into olive oil or wine. So the wine press in the cistern there, we know 2,000 years ago there was a garden. And in the place where he was crucified, at the skull, there was a garden. And in the garden, there was a tomb. What do we know about the tomb? Well, we know a lot, but we'll look at right now just 6 points. Here's what we know. The tomb was hewn from rock. It wasn't a cave, but it was hewn out of solid rock. It was owned by a wealthy man, sealed with a large rolled stone. The tomb was large enough for 5 or more. There was an entryway, an entry room, a place to the right, and a body site, and that the tomb was never before used. So starting with the first point, what type of tomb was Jesus Christ buried in? Well, it was not a natural cave, and it wasn't built with bricks, like a mausoleum would be. It was hewn out of rock, out of solid rock. And we have a photograph here my wife Cheryl took in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem Garden Tomb, and that's the face of the tomb. A lot of people go there and say, well, why are those cinder blocks there? When they were excavating this, the wall right there, that's actually a little cliff of the top of Mount Moriah, began to fall in. And so they quickly built these cinder blocks there to prop up the wall to keep it from further deteriorating. And people have asked, well, why don't they cover it up? The Garden Tomb Association that maintains this, why don't they plaster over it and make it look real? Because they're not trying to make things look real. They're presenting evidence, historical, geographic, archaeological evidence, exactly as they found it, which is real exciting. So this Garden Tomb in Jerusalem seems to meet all the requirements of the location near the site of the crucifixion, plus it was hewn out of solid rock. Now, the next point is that it was owned by a wealthy man. All right, so this photograph here shows you the inside of the tomb, and there is no question that only a wealthy man could have had this construction performed. It would have taken a skilled laborers many months to carve this out. And when you're carving out a solid rock, you can't make a mistake because you can't fix it. And it's amazing the work they did. Joseph of Arimathea, this tomb that we are seeing today, that you could go visit, this tomb, the second point, is beyond any doubt owned by a wealthy man. Point number 3, the tomb was sealed with a large stone that was rolled in front of it. Right? The room was sealed with a large rolled stone. Now, my wife, she was very busy over there in Israel taking photographs, and here's one of her photos, and you can see, we'll zoom in on this. Now, that man standing with his back to the entrance of the tomb for the most part, it's right around there, and that groove right in front of the tomb is a groove. It's been there for 2,000 years. It's the type of groove they would dig in front of tombs where they'd have a large round stone shaped like, say, a wagon wheel, only much thicker, wider, and large, and they'd roll it right in front of the entrance of the tomb to block the tomb. And then they'd be able to seal it, and in this case they put temple guards in front of it to make sure no one moved the stone or stole the body. Now, the fourth point is that this tomb was large enough for 5 or more people, and it was a very large tomb. In fact, when you go in it today, when you go to visit, you could probably fit, well, there we have it, you could probably fit 20 people or more inside this tomb. Now, there's something really fascinating. Let's keep that photo up there for a moment. For the 5th point is that there is an entry room, and then a place to the right, and another place for a body site. Now, I'm going to read a verse here that tells us that a few women went to anoint the body of Jesus, and as they were going there, they worried who would move the stone for them because it was so big, they'd need help. But they got there and the stone had been rolled away already. And when they went in, now that gate was put in there to keep people tourists and Christians, and people would go there, and you're allowed in the entry room today. But they shut that gate. The entry room is on the other side of that gate. People earlier would walk through, there was no gate, and they would begin to chip away at the rock right where Jesus lay, at the right of your screen. That's the place where his body lay. So they put that gate there so people can't do that. But there's an entryway, and then there's that little walkway to the place where they would lie 3 bodies. This tomb was built, a weeping chamber where you entered, and then a place for 3 bodies to be laid. Now, what's fascinating is I'm going to show you a drawing. And did I read this? Now, let me read this verse for you first. Mark chapter 16, verses 5 and 6. Read. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man. Now, who was this? Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome, these 3 women. they entered the tomb, and they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side. You notice that? There's so many details in the Bible. Normally you read it, you don't pay attention to all the little details. But the more you investigate, they become fascinating. Because these three women entered the tomb and saw a young man, an angel, if you read all the passages together, clothed in a long white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. They entered, they saw him, they were shocked, but he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him?" All right, now, I've got here just some little drawings I did, not very fancy. I'm not much of an artist. But these drawings show, a potential shape of a tomb. Now here, imagine this is a rock wall, and this was dug in to the rock wall. And three women are coming in to enter, and just like a little cave that you might find actually out in nature somewhere. They go to enter, and it's not possible that there can be someone to the right, sitting to the right, and they see him, and then he has to point to where an empty body would lay. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work in a cave or a tomb that might be shaped like that. So we have another possibility here, and this is a tomb where, let's say this is a wall, and this was hewn in, and the entrance is all the way on the right. The entrance is on the right. So three women come in through the entrance. This doesn't work either, because if there's somebody sitting in there pointing to a body, it's not possible. He couldn't be on their right. He'd have to either be straight ahead of them or off to their left. So here is a diagram of a tomb that meets the description of basically the blocking of the characters in the gospel narratives. Three women enter the tomb all together, and of course they're in the weeping chamber, and they're startled by a young man sitting on their right. They're startled, and he says to them, "Don't be alarmed." See, they saw him first before they saw the place where Jesus lay, because they could have seen the empty grave clothes. But no, they saw him first. They were startled. And he said, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. See the place where they laid him." And he points just beyond him, because they saw him first. And he points, here's the place where they lay him. And they see the grave clothes. And they were all laid out there, but they were wrapped. They were laid wrapped, as though they weren't unwrapped, but the body within, Jesus Christ, was raised from the dead by the power of God, and the grave clothes just dropped. They're wrapped as though they had been when they laid him in the tomb. Wow. There is so much that points to the authenticity, not only of the tomb and this Jerusalem garden tomb, but of the resurrection of Jesus Christ himself. Also, what else do we know about this tomb? This is powerful. Brace yourselves. It's a tomb that was never before used. Now, we have some footage we took in November 1995 inside this tomb, and I'm going to show this to you. And we start out, here's a door that was put on the inside of the tomb, and there's the cinder blocks. And there's the tomb, the part you can't get to. And notice in there, there are three places for three bodies to be laid. And this one, which is the farthest to the left, as you enter, and you turn to the right to look, then on your left is the one where Jesus Christ was laid. Now, how do we know that? Well, first of all, you could see how it's cut. The workmen cut and finished this body location. The ledge there where you see where his feet would be, and on the other side, maybe we'll be able to see it later, maybe not, his head. All right, that location for that body is completely finished. Now what we're going to do, we're going to roll a little bit more footage. We're going to go to the right. And the fascinating thing, now that's what we were just looking at, the site where Jesus Christ's body was laid. Now as you pan over, and that's how high the tomb is, You pan over to the right, and there's room for a second and a third body, but if we could freeze it there, they are not completed. The workmen did not dig. Now, what they needed to do was dig deeper and further in at the places where their heads and their feet would lay to finish the carving, the work, making this tomb. But they never finished it. This was, as the Bible says, a brand new tomb, carved in rock, never before used. How would you think after 2,000 years, how could we prove that it was a tomb that was never before used? How could you possibly prove that? But God, in His incredible wisdom and foresight, He knew to put Jesus Christ in a tomb that was finished, but not quite. It was almost finished. In fact, there was only one location for one body was finished. Because with the wealth of Joseph of Arimathea and his garden and his cisterns, he had a lot of money, right? If they had used the tomb and then they used one site, they could have used the next and used the next, and they would have, of course, finished it, but they didn't. They didn't have time to finish it before it was used for Jesus Christ. You know, millions of people from around the world have visited the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem. Millions of people have gone there and seen with their own eyes the evidence remaining today of God's message of the resurrection of Jesus Christ written in stone. There's another location in Jerusalem, and many Christians have thought that was the place where Jesus died in the tomb. It's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it's a sad story, really. Constantine, the Roman emperor, the emperor who became a Christian, and he mandated that the whole Christian empire, everybody had to become Christians, basically. And it obviously wasn't real conversions, but that's what happened. And his mother went to Israel as an archaeologist. And she went to discover all these holy sites. And every site she looked for, she found. It was a miracle. I'm being sarcastic. She didn't find all the sites she said she found. She went to this place, and you go look, the sepulcher, it doesn't work. She said she even found the 3 crosses. This is 400 years later. She didn't find the 3 crosses. It's a sad thing. And you know, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's not on Mount Moriah. It is on the other side of the Tyropoeon Valley, just on the other side of the Temple Mount, not on the hill that the temple was built, not on Mount Moriah. The evidence is overwhelming that Jesus Christ was brought by God his Father to Mount Moriah in Jerusalem to be crucified on the cross and to be raised from the dead. So Moses wrote a story of Abraham offering up Isaac, or almost offering up Isaac, on Mount Moriah a long, long time ago. In fact, Abraham lived about 4,000 years ago. Well, Abraham, Isaac, and Jesus, we'll get to Jesus' part in just a moment, but to start with the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis chapter 22, the beginning of the story of Mount Moriah. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. You know, this story presents all kinds of difficulties, confusion, and problems to people who reject the whole truth of the Bible. Because they say, why would God set up such a scenario? First of all, God was very much against human sacrifice. At the time, human sacrifice was common among the people in what today is Palestine, in that area. But God said it was an evil and a wicked thing, and he forbid his followers from sacrificing their children to idols and to gods. Why would God tell Abraham, come and sacrifice your son? Another problem with the story, why would God say, take Isaac, your son, your only son? Because Abraham had another son, Ishmael. Now I know that Isaac was Abraham's son of faith, But Ishmael was Abraham's son. Not only that, Ishmael was circumcised according to God's covenant. God said to Abraham, if your descendants who come from your body are circumcised, then they're part of my covenant. Interesting. Well, so God said, offer your son as a sacrifice, which is strange. And he said, take your son, your only son Isaac. He emphasizes that when he had another son Ishmael. Then he says, take him to the land and offer him there in Moriah, the certain land, mountain I will tell you of. Well, if this was just a test for Abraham, why would they have to go this 3-day journey to this land on this special mount? Why couldn't God test Abraham this way, right where he was? These questions perplex those who don't read the whole story. The answer to these questions is incredibly beautiful, because the answer in this story is the entire message of Jesus Christ and what he came to do. So let's look at some of the story here. Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, his servants, and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. There's so much focus in this story on the place. Just like with David and the place of the threshing floor. And with Jesus and in the place where they crucified him, there was a garden. And we'll see that as we continue here. But notice the parallels between Abraham and Isaac and God the Father and his son Jesus Christ. Here we'll continue with the story. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham and said, his father, and said, my father. I said, here am I, my son. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Imagine what that question did to Abraham's heart, how it must have been tearing within him. And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. That's the New King James. The Old King James says, God will provide himself a lamb for the offering. And the 2 of them went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son, who was, by the way, they call him a lad, but he was a young man. He was a grown man. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. He was going to kill his son, kill him, and then burn him on the altar. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Please, anything to distract me from what I'm about to do. And the angel said, do not lay your hand on the lad, or do not do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, just as David on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite said, he lifted his eyes and he saw the angel of the Lord standing between heaven and earth. And that's exactly what Jesus Christ does for us. But Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. There it is. There Abraham lifted his eyes and looked. What did he see? He saw behind him there was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. You see, the sacrifice was instead of Isaac. And that's what all the sacrifices of the Jewish religion were, to forgive the people of their sins. And these sacrifices were in place of the people so they could be forgiven. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, this is the Moriah prophecy, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Wow. Moses wrote this. Jesus Christ, reading the book of Genesis, told us that Moses wrote Genesis, just as everyone in Israel had known all along. Moses wrote what Abraham said, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Wow. Now, we're going to consider this all a little more carefully. Why did this whole story happen? Well, God was teaching a lesson. The Christian application of this passage is consistent with the Old Testament sacrificial system, that these animals were killed and offered as a substitution so that the people would not have to pay for their own sins, because this animal was sacrificed for their sins. Hence the ram, usually a lamb, according to God's commands in the Bible. The lamb was killed for their sins so that they would not have to be punished by God. Now, in the New Testament, we have the same thing, because that's why Jesus Christ came. And he lived, he was perfect, without spot or blemish, without sin. And he died as the substitution for us so we don't have to die. But Isaac here in the story, Abraham, the father, offers up Isaac, his only son. Isaac is a symbol of Jesus Christ. He's a type of Christ. Isaac's birth was miraculous. Abraham and Sarah, they were beyond their years. She was not able to have a child. She had gone through her change of life. She had stopped ovulating, right? Jesus was born, his birth, his conception was a miracle. In fact, Abraham was 99. Is that what the story says in Genesis? And Sarah was 90 years old. And God came and said, you will have a son. I will perform it. And then Mary, it was a miraculous conception because she had never known a man. Yet the virgin conceived, as Isaiah prophesied. And so Isaac was a type of Jesus Christ. His birth was miraculous. His father went to offer up his only son, Isaac. Jesus' birth miraculous, and his father, God, went to offer up his only son, Jesus Christ. They were both innocent. Isaac hadn't done anything to deserve to be put to death right at that moment. He hadn't deserved that. Isaac, I don't think you can find anything in the Bible, hardly anything, it's unusual, that Isaac did wrong. He was a really great guy. A lot of the guys in the Bible, all their dirty laundry is there for everyone to read, which shows that they didn't just make up a religion. Because if Peter was making this stuff up, he wouldn't say, I denied Christ. He wouldn't say that, I ran like a coward. He wouldn't say that. If David was making this stuff up, he wouldn't say, I committed adultery with Bathsheba, and Uriah the Hittite, her husband, I had him murdered. But we know this book isn't just men who wanted to make themselves famous and start a religion, because then they'd put just all the good things about them in the book. But all their worst sins are there for all the world to read, because God wanted to show that you don't have to be good on your own, because you can't be good enough on your own. In fact, if we all admit it, we do some pretty terrible things. Just like Peter, just like David, just like Abraham did some pretty terrible things. But God enabled us to be forgiven because he provided a sacrifice. Now let's go on. Jesus Christ, he really led a good life. He did nothing wrong. He led the perfect life. He was the perfect, spotless lamb, the perfect sacrifice. And even Pilate, when he judged him, you know what Pilate said? Recorded in Luke chapter 23, verses 14 and 15. I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod. Jesus stood before the Jewish high priest, and he stood before Pilate and Herod all in the same night in early morning hours. And they brought some false witnesses against Jesus, but even they contradicted themselves. Not even his enemies could accuse him. And even today, Judaism considers Jesus a good man, a rabbi. Islam considers him a prophet. Buddhists and Hindus, Jesus was a holy man. Well, not even his enemies could condemn him, because he did live a perfect life. And you know what's amazing? Even today, you find some liberals who hate Christians, hate Christianity, hate the Bible. You virtually never hear them say anything against Jesus Christ. Some of the greatest liberals in the world who really hate God and really hate morality and love and righteousness, they speak only kind words of Jesus Christ.